Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Megan Brown. I'm a Senior Research Associate in Medical Education at Newcastle University in the UK, where my work focuses on qualitative methodologies, the intersection of educating and training with disability and workforce research. And today I want to explore how poetry can serve as a powerful tool in medical education research. It can challenge dominant narratives, center disabled voices, and reimagine the ways in which we communicate our research. Before I begin, I think it's really important to acknowledge my own positionality in this work. My work is grounded in the belief that knowledge is socially constructed and that disrupting dominant frameworks like the medical model of disability is really essential for creating inclusive educational spaces. I'm multiply disabled. I'm autistic. I have a medical degree and I practiced for only 2 years. That's the very young looking version of me in scrubs in the far left photograph on the screen. Before leaving clinical practice with what I now identify as autistic burnout, I use a walking stick, sometimes a mobility scooter. You'll see in the picture in the middle photograph on screen. The far image on the right-hand side of the two concentric circles with the outer circle being labeled given and the inner circle being labeled chosen is a positionality exercise that I like to do with teams, with myself. And I've drawn in these symbols that represent different elements of my own identity as a way of trying to recognize those more in my own work. The symbols are from my brain, so they might not all make immediate sense, but I've already let you know a little bit about my experience with disability, about me being autistic, but other key elements of my identity for this talk in particular would be that I'm from the UK. So the term I use when I speak is disabled doctors rather than doctors with a disability. That's just a UK norm. I refer to myself as a disabled person, but I recognize the plurality of terms here, that there's no single correct approach. Whilst being disabled has led to me encountering many barriers, I also have significant privilege and support that has allowed me to persist. I've got a close and supportive family. I have financial security. I've had access to higher education. I live in a mostly politically stable country that hasn't experienced recent armed conflict. So overall, I'm speaking from a kind of mixed perspective, but a lived experience perspective in terms of disability. And a research-based perspective, but with a very certain take based on that background. I don't and I can't represent all disabled doctors or medical students, but I hope to contribute to a broader conversation that that brings to the fore some of those diverse voices and helps to challenge some of those exclusionary structures by pushing for a more inclusive and equitable spaces in medical education and in healthcare. This talks about disrupting ableism through poetry. So I wanted to give some background on my understanding of this significant issue in medical education. Ableism in medical education manifests in many ways. I'm sure that most, if not all of you know that how it can shape disabled learners' experiences in very significant and harmful ways. The quotes that are on screen are from disabled medical students, disabled doctors, across different projects I've been involved in, and they only scratch the surface in terms of highlighting the barriers that disabled people face in medicine, from feeling unseen and undervalued to the pressures of working twice as hard to prove that they belong. Medical education is a system that rewards resilience whilst failing to acknowledge the structural inequalities that necessitate it. In the UK, disabled doctors and professionals face persistent inequities at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels. So we see significant attainment gaps, low disclosure rates, systemic barriers to progression. So for instance, 28% of medical students who disclose a disability at university choose not to disclose to the General Medical Council, the UK regulator of doctors, on qualification. At the postgraduate level, while 19% of doctors disclose a disability in anonymous surveys, only 2% report it in formal staff records. And these numbers reflect a culture of silence, of fear, one where disclosure carries professional risk. And my take on the research landscape would be that we're behind the US. We have quite a lot of gaps in our understanding of key statistics, but also of experiences, available support, and what can be done to improve what is on offer. taking you in a slightly different direction now. This is a photograph of a stone sculpture of Apollo. In ancient Greek mythology, Apollo is the god of healing and of rational thought. Sounds very medical. But Apollo is also the god of music and poetry. It's an interesting combination, and that's something that we've grown to see as a dichotomy. But the question that I'd like to ask is, what can we learn from Apollo? And that's an important question because traditional research, which we often associate with the scientific method, can fall short in capturing the full complexity of lived experience. If medical education is a pendulum, like the photograph on screen now, we've been trying to prove our value as a field within the sciences really hard, and that's led to big advances in our methods. We now have well-developed guidance, often stepwise guidance, agreement on how to do things. But my argument would be that we've swung the pendulum so hard towards fixity and rigidity of process and approach that we've lost the other side of that pendulum's course, which is mystery and wonder and creative freedom. We need emotion and subjectivity and creative approaches to research to help us challenge those established ways of knowing, which, as we have seen, often have ableism really deeply baked into them. But poetry suffers from an image problem. It seems tricksy. It's like the Sphinx. It talks in riddles. It closely guards its secrets. And when I discuss poetry with students or researchers, I often get the sense that they think of poetry as being too clever. It's trying to trick people. There's a risk of misunderstanding, of getting it wrong. And that's a high risk. And they also complain of feeling disconnected from the poetry that they've encountered so far. School has a lot to answer for. But what I think many people's anxieties boil down to is a sense of disenfranchisement. Poetry is not theirs. It doesn't belong to them. Access to poetry has only been granted to those who toe an official line. And it's seen as this kind of, it styles itself often as this exclusive and highbrow thing that is out of most people's reach. And when I was a medical student and a junior doctor, I really shared those fears. But learning about poetry within research changed the way that I thought about poems, about poets, about my relationship to them as a reader. And I began to recognize that poems are about interpretation, just like there's many ways to interpret research data. And that opened the door to poetry for me. And poetry is powerful. It is the space for thoughts to breathe. It helps us create words that burn. And that leads us on to considering poetic inquiry, which is the use of poetry as a research method. This was created by multiculturalists and feminists in the 1970s, who urged the field of qualitative research to make substantial space for the ways of knowing and being of minoritized people. Poetic inquiry is a really broad umbrella term. Poetry can be involved in small or significant ways in research within poetic inquiry at different points and for different purposes in a research project. While poetry has a presence in the medical humanities, within curricula, within journals, reflective practice, it's still not yet been widely accepted or even often recognized as a research approach within medical education. And this is a missed opportunity because poetry as a research tool allows us to explore emotion, embodiment, social critique in ways that traditional methods often don't prioritize. Poetry enables to attend more deeply to participant voices, to explore the relationship between language and meaning, and increase reflexivity in our own research practices as we develop or co-develop poems. Poems can be really powerful. They can communicate deep emotions. They can speak to people in lasting ways. And for me, poetizing research helps me move beyond description of someone's experience to interpretation and meaning making. It feels more inherently analytical. And poetry can also help us to resist epistemic injustice, which is the systematic undervaluing of disabled people's knowledge. In medicine, we often see two forms of epistemic injustice: testimonial injustice, where disabled people's experiences are dismissed, you don't look sick, and hermeneutical injustice, where dominant frameworks fail to make sense of disabled lives, the medical model. Poetry can serve as a form of resistance. It can help us to reclaim voice, to counter ableist narratives like those of deficiency that we still often see within medical education, overall can help us rehumanize our practice, rehumanize medical education. So this is the how-to section, the nuts and bolts of poetic inquiry for those who are interested in learning more about how you might actually go about doing this within research. There are different types of poetic inquiry. I mostly deal with participant-voiced poems. These are sometimes called data poems or found poems, and they're created with participants or from their data somehow. These aren't all the types of poems on screen that you can create. I've just listed participant-voiced, autobiographical, and research poetry. But they're the ones that I've thought seemed relevant. So autobiographical poems, are you reflecting on your own experiences as a researcher? You might write field notes that are poetic. And research poems, sometimes also called literature voiced or theory voiced poems. And it's more something that you can do as an alternative to or as an adjunct to a literature review. And there are tons of different ways of creating poems, participant voice poems I'm talking about specifically now. When I first began working with poetic inquiry, I used Glesney's method of poetic transcription because there are some structured rules, but not too many. So you only use the participant's own words. You preserve syntax, that's the ordering of words within a phrase. And this approach for me was a way to center participant voice while maintaining the integrity of participants' languages. But over time, my approach evolved. And I now use more of a multi-step process that includes thematic analysis, critical poetic analysis, and collaboration with participants themselves or with creatives. And I've developed this approach as I feel it gives a little more guidance on the exact steps, actually, rather than being a kind of set of principles or loose rules. And I like to see how we can move more towards the collaboration and co-production of poetry in general. It's not something that I started out doing, but it is a direction that my practice has moved in. Step one is thematic analysis. This will feel quite familiar to those of us who are qualitative researchers. Thematic coding, which most usually involves inductive coding, where you're deriving the codes from the data. You might be bringing codes from a kind of list of pre-existing terms or ideas from a theoretical frame, but you have a code list. And then once you've got that as an overview, as a description of your data, you can really then begin the poetic analysis. In this step, in step two, for critical poetic analysis, after that initial coding, you read the data within each code and you listen for what Kiana Cutts describes as an intuitive, creative knowing of what feels right that poet researchers employ as a reflexive and necessary practice. That can take some time to develop. But you'll see, I think, as you try this, and as you try this in a group or in a supported setting, you can read the data aloud and listen to those phrases that stand out or those ways of speaking that stand out of that what feels right. Next, I'd recommend extensive memoing about possible themes and what the data says to try and capture the salient points in the data. I tend to write, after I've done kind of descriptive memoing about content, I write poetic memos for each set of coded data as well, that describes different emotions, participants' key ideas, might be metaphors, images that I want to bring out, phrases that felt significant. And it's important that the images and the ideas in the poetic memos come from the data, that you're staying as close to the data as you can. Then within this step, I edit the poetry to try and support the trustworthiness that aligns with critical poetic inquiry. So checking for kind of cultural competence within any kind of poetic memos and the poetry that's being created, checking that it does engage with and critique inequity. And editing the poetry in that way moves the poetic analysis from free writing more into that poetic craft, whilst ensuring that the poem also accomplishes the goals of a critical poetic inquiry, which is to critique, to be critical, to be culturally relevant and sensitive. Step three, once you've got the poetic memos for each code, it's thinking about how those codes and memos are connected to create themes. And you can pull verbatim quotes that illustrate those themes and put them into a poem. for each theme. You can write several poems under each theme. There's no hard and fast rule about how many poems you have to create or what level. Are you creating poems at code level? Are you creating probably, you know, there might, maybe if the code is big, are you creating poems at a theme level? My process usually includes identifying key meanings for the theme and then pulling kind of key images, words, concepts from transcripts. So I have a collection of possible resources to build a poem from. And then once I have that in front of me, I like to add and layer in elements of poetic craft like metaphor, form, spacing. And that takes time to develop. That does take personal study. When I started, I had very, very little understanding of poetic structure and techniques. And it's okay that that takes time to develop. I would still class myself very much as an amateur when it comes to writing poems. Step 4 is co-production, so meeting with participants or poets and or both to involve them in that co-production, or to conduct an art quality check. Wherever possible, it's best to co-produce poems. But if that's not possible for whatever reason, it's at least best to check in with another experienced poet or someone who reads poetry, is interested in poetry, to ask, does the research stand up to or accomplish some sort of artistic quality? You can also use this Sullivan checklist that I've got on screen as a personal tool. I appreciate how hard it can be to establish connections with other researchers, other poets when you're new. And this checklist was how I got thinking about quality in the first place. Even asking another member of your team, even if they're not a big poetry buff, to read the poems and look at the checklist for another opinion is helpful. Get someone else's opinion. Quality in arts-based research, it's worth mentioning, is long debated. So for me, I need to know that, you know, does the poem in some way move the human spirit? And that sounds very lofty. Does it affect people or resonate or seem to land with people when they read it? Does it leave some sort of lasting impression? Is what I mean by that. And also, does the poem effectively employ some poetic techniques, some elements of the craft, so it's respectful to the craft and it's in recognition of the craft. But I'm a firm believer in good enough participant voice poems. We're all learning. We can all develop our approach and technique and always improve upon what we're doing. It's very much like with other types of qualitative research. It's a work in progress, but we have to start somewhere. Step 5 is the presentation of the data, and that's about sharing the poems back with participants and communities. Really important if you've not already done that and you've not had participants involved from the start, which you might already have done. This is data from those communities, and it's important that we share it back to help support or serve those communities as a kind of end goal of our research. Might be a series of research poems that you can share back asynchronously. You might have an open mic sharing session within a community, a workshop online where people are invited to read or hear research poems, respond to them in a kind of call and response format. And it gives, you know, that is a way of trying to make that data as accessible to as many people as possible. I won't go into depth about poetic form. As I said, it's something that I think we can all serve to learn more about. These are the 3 types of poetic form that I tend to use the most when it comes to creating participant voice poems. Free verse, which is rhymed or unrhymed lines with no fixed pattern, mimics ordinary speech. So there's no set structure to that poem usually. Haiku, which are short poems, you might be familiar with them. They're often about nature, a Japanese form of poem, and it's 3 unrhymed lines. And what's distinctive about those lines is the syllable pattern. So 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and then 5 syllables. And you can repeat that over and over because they're very, very short, obviously. And then prose poetry, which combines prose and poetry, plays with, it looks like a section from a novel if you look at a prose poem, but the rhythm within that writing is more poetry-like, so it plays with, but that's what I mean by metrical overtones. It plays with rhythm. As I said, I wouldn't worry about these. I think if you're getting started, something like a haiku is nice because it gives you a simple structure. Free verse gives you more flexibility to incorporate the phrasing and the syntax from your participants' original transcripts. But very much a work in progress for me, learning about different types of poetic form, I'm sure for many of us. I wanted to draw on some examples of poetry in my own research to hopefully break down the process a little bit and make it more tangible. But also to start a discussion of the impact poetry can have. And I hope as you listen to these examples that you might be prompted to think about how the poems I'm going to share with you land and how they make you feel also as a recipient of that research. So in this first example, I collaborated with disabled medical students over time, longitudinal studies. We're actually about 3/4 of the way through the study. It's an ongoing one. And we've been co-creating poetry that documents learners' journeys into practice. So when we first met them back in spring of last year, they were final year medical students. They just sat finals. Now they've been working as a first year doctor for 8 months. And we've been holding in-depth interviews with them every few months and co-creating poems. And there was very little guidance on how to do this. And from what we could see, there was no precedent for this in medical education. So we developed an approach, which we also plan to reflect critically on and share. And following the first interview, we transcribed that interview. We took it through the process of poetic inquiry that I've previously described to create a selection of draft poems that we shared with each participant. And we then sent them their interview transcript and poems in advance of our next interview. And had about half the time in the next interview looking at the poems, reading them, selecting one to workshop together. And we asked them to read the poem aloud. We asked them to suggest changes, reflect on turns of phrase that they would or wouldn't use in the poem. And so we come out of that interview with a poem that they're happy to approve. And so at the end of the study, 4 interview time points over a year will mean 4 poems per participant. We have 6 in total, so that'll be 24 poems, in addition to our interview data, which will also be undergoing a longitudinal reflexive thematic analysis. Here are 2 poems from the same participant. The pseudonym for this participant's Resourceful. They chose that name to represent their data. One of these poems is from when they're a final year medical student, and one is from 3 months after starting work as a doctor. The poem on the left of the screen, Blue Badge, refers to Resourceful's parking pass. So when I first met them, they actually brought this to show me on Zoom to prove that they could participate in the study, despite us not asking for any sort of evidence of disability. And that really stood out to me, and we came back to it in the interview. So I'm going to read that poem that we co-created aloud. Blue Badge. I started carrying it around in my bag, not for its purpose, but as a pass. The issue is you're never with the same team. And there's no easy way to explain hidden things, to explain what happens in my absence. This, we felt, reflected the navigation of hidden disabilities in clinical environments and the ways in which trainees struggle to make visible their support needs, but how that can negatively affect them elsewhere. They can't use their parking pass for its intended purpose. They can't always easily explain their absences or the support that they need to succeed. The second poem is called A Warning, and you'll see that this is structured differently. This is a prose poem, the type of poem that looks like prose but plays with rhythm in a way that a poem does. And we chose to write the poem like this because the second interview felt more fragmented, more hurried. It was filled with the pressures of early clinical practice, and the shift in structure mirrors the shift in Resourceful's experience, where the early poem, Blue Badge, highlights the struggle to be seen and validated. A Warning captures the relentless pace, the emotional weight of transitioning into work as a doctor in relation to a very specific experience regarding the need for medication. So I'm going to read the poem out now. A Warning. No, just trust me. Bring it in boxes. It doesn't matter that they're not controlled, that they're over the counter, that they're nothing. Don't carry them in your pocket. Don't take them out in public. Hide them. Hide yourself. 20 boxes of bulk of proof of weight, then you'll have to leave them somewhere, your bag, but not on the ward, not in a storeroom. It's an infection control risk. Put it in staff changing. If you need them, you'll have to walk quickly and you'll have to be ready to defend yourself. I know the medication store is like a bank with cameras and buzzers and QR keys, but it won't matter. As a student, you couldn't be referred. You're a doctor now. You are seen, known, and judged. Just trust me. These two poems together offer a window into the evolving experience of disability in early training in the UK. And I hope that you'll find that they invite us to consider not just policy and accommodations, but the emotional and narrative dimensions of navigating these spaces. What does it mean to be both seen and unseen? How does the system shape who gets to stay and at what cost? The second example is slightly different. The focus here is on differential attainment, the systematic differences in training and assessment outcomes based on demographic characteristics. It's a persistent issue in health professions education, sometimes called different things in different countries. The UK uses differential attainment. You might see awarding gap or attainment gap. This is me considering the importance of co-producing poetry. It's important to flag. So these poems aren't co-produced. You might find that they read differently. That would be interesting to hear reflections on. They were actually created in a secondary data analysis. So I never met these people, which is another limitation of this study, made the analysis different to what I'm used to. And the secondary data analysis, the original data set was a wider study on minoritized students' experiences of attainment in higher education. So actually across different degree courses, but we only looked at the data from health profession students. We felt that despite growing awareness of differential attainment, the reason we wanted to do this analysis was that disabled learners' experiences have often been overlooked in those discussions. And we aim to change that. So we use poetic inquiry to explore disabled health profession students' experience of differential attainment. So not just numbers, but the human impact, the emotions, the daily realities. And so let's start with Blake. So he has a poem which we've titled Not This, But That, which highlights some of the contradictions that he's experienced within his education. Not this, but that. Not dropped out, but thrown out. Not silence, but noise. Not passion, but overwhelm. Not brief, but detailed. Not guided, but indefinite. Not enough, never enough. Not accessible, not supported. Not more than one thing. Not me, but here. Blake is expected to succeed, but given no support, he feels actively thrown out of his education by unclear expectations, by a lack of guidance and support, rather than how he's been seen as someone passively dropping out of his studies. So the hidden curriculum, those unspoken expectations of higher education, make it harder for students like Blake to navigate their studies. And then we have Patience. Her poem is called Good Looking, and it's a shorter poem, as you'll see, but intentionally shorter. And I'll read it out for you. Good looking. Services are available for those who are lucky, for those who know how to look. Patience's words reflect another layer of difficulty, privilege, and access. So services exist, but only for those who are lucky enough to find them or who know how to look. And for disabled students from minoritized backgrounds, like Patience, who is a Black woman, these barriers are amplified, creating a system where survival, not success, is the norm, and survival itself within such a system is remarkable. So through rhythm, through structure, through carefully chosen words, poetry can be used to highlight the gaps between what's said and experienced, so between policy and practice, between access and exclusion. And we hope that I hope that Blake and Patience's poems illustrate those tensions in stark terms. They remind us that differential attainment's not just a kind of statistical issue. It's something that really shapes students' experiences and futures, and often in ways that are invisible to those who are in positions of power. The final example that I'm offering is slightly different in that it explores the use of poetry to communicate disabled patients' experiences. And this has been part of my work recently to scope the acceptability of poetry for patients for a big project involving disabled doctors and disabled patients, and thinking about their experience with one another, and possible education and training needs as that moves forward. And there's a lot here, but essentially we were asking how poetry can be used as a methodological tool to enhance understanding of disabled individuals' experiences in research. So this was with patients. It could also be done with staff. We ran a workshop with a relatively structured poetry exercise to try. It was a sort of fill the blanks poem, add a descriptive word here, add something you imagine yourself to be here. We only had 1 hour with them, so it was quite tight on time. And then we asked for feedback on accessibility, comfort, support, and the potential value of poetry for exploring feelings, emotions, and self-perception. Now, just to give you some context, the workshop was for 10 people. We had 260 applicants for this workshop. There was a huge appetite for these creative approaches to research amongst patients, which I think is very important for bearing in mind. This is attractive. People want to engage with this and want to do this. And there was a real mix of patients, but most of the patients who attended the workshop had never tried poetry. Maybe some had read some poetry, but they weren't professional poets. But I felt that their imagery was really powerful. They created these poems in just 15 minutes, if you believe it. We've got people likening themselves to torn paper, to white noise, to duck's legs, to a mockingbird. And I think it's just so powerful, the way that people are using language here and how that language captures the complexities of embodiment, of agency that being disabled often brings. And so I just wanted to share this a slightly different example as a possibility. Poetry here is more of an elicitation device, really, as a way of starting and opening a conversation across groups of potential participants. Okay, so a few concluding thoughts before question and answer portion. There are lots of different ways to poetize medical education research. You don't have to fully commit to becoming a poet researcher full on right now. There are lots of different ways it can be incorporated into our research. It can be through poetic journaling. You might choose to use poetry as a reflexive tool. You can integrate certain elements of poetic inquiry into your analysis without fully creating poems or fully presenting poems as your end product. You might focus on specific techniques, for example, like metaphor. Poetry can also be woven into outreach and engagement activities throughout a research project. And there might be other ways that you can think of using poetry, and I'd love to hear more suggestions and more thoughts. Academic research still really often frames disability in very medical or deficit-based terms. But I hope that through this talk, we've been able to consider how poetic inquiry shifts the focus of our research to personal narratives that centers disabled voices in ways that are deeply human and can be very emotionally resonant. Poetry doesn't just present data, it brings warmth, it brings depth, it can help us to make our research findings more accessible and meaningful for lots of different audiences, educators, patients, healthcare professionals, policymakers. To me, it's a very important way of helping to bridge that gap between abstract data and the very real people behind it. And that makes people more likely to act, more likely to sit up and pay attention to what you're saying and what it is that you want them to do with that data. And I think that's how poetry goes beyond documentation. It's when poetry is used well in research, it can, and it should really very much be a tool for advocacy. It allows disabled people and researchers to challenge systemic barriers and to push for meaningful change in education and healthcare and policy. I think overall, for me, poetic inquiry helps remind us that research isn't just about studying people. People aren't just kind of sources of data that we can mine and then create papers from, and isn't that great for our careers? It's actually about listening and understanding and amplifying the voices that are most often unheard to create change, to co-create change with the people who own those voices. Thank you so much to everyone for listening, but also to Dr. Meeks for this incredible opportunity. Thank you also to Dr. Martina Kelly, who's a program director at the University of Calgary. Been a great collaborator with me on all things poetic in medical education. and actually helped co-author one of the methods papers that I've written on the topic. Just a list of references. Thank you all so much again for your time and for listening. I've been Dr. Megan Brown, and this talk has been on disrupting ableism in medical education through poetry. I hope that you have found it of interest.